Yes, look, I want to ask some questions about the proposed third runway at Tullamarine. So in particular, starting with what the expected timeline is going to be for the release of the community consultation of the major development plan. Your website's still just saying 2018.
So, Senator, I'll ask Ms Leonie Horrocks, the General Manager for the Airports Branch in the division, to give you the big advice that we can on the major development plans for this third runway.
Leonie Horrocks, General Manager Airports. Senator, we're expecting the draft major development plan to go out in July or August at this stage.
Okay. All right, so the residents, I've got a group of residents who are very keen to see it.
I've no doubt.
And who are very, they're concerned about what the potential noise and pollution impacts are going to be of the additional runway. Mm-hmm. They are also concerned that having 60 days to respond, given this is going to be a rather substantial piece of work, is going to be very tight for them. So are you aware as to whether any of the MDP's studies have already been completed and whether it would be possible to release them earlier than that July-August period?
Senator, from memory, a number of the studies, and I'd have to go back and check on notice exactly which ones, have been released through the Community Aviation Consultation Group, which is the community forum, and they have been releasing them as they become complete. So they've been passed through, but I can get you on notice a list of which ones have actually been released.
Okay, and whether there will be more that are going to be released
Absolutely,
prior
Senator.
to that July-August date.
Yep.
Okay, and so what's the timing then? So that's presumably that draft plan goes to government before it gets released for community consultation, does it? Is that the process? Because the plan's done by the airport, isn't it?
Yes, Senator. So the major development plan, there is a process whereby the airport can choose to provide us with an exposure draft, and that enables us to look at the data and look what the proposal contains, look for compliance with the Airports Act, and then provide comments back to the airport for any issues that we feel need to be reviewed or amended. We also, where there is an exposure draft, we get comments from other agencies such as CASA and Air Services, Department of Environment, and we pass all of those comments back through to the airport. Then the preliminary draft major development plan is circulated for comments, so a minimum of 60 business days. And then following the closure of that period, the airport is required to give due consideration to all submissions received, and then when that draft MDP is submitted to government, the information of how those issues raised during submissions is demonstrated in a report.
So do you know in this instance whether that process of the airport giving you an exposure draft, do you expect that to be the case?
Yep, that has occurred.
That has occurred, all right. Yes. So you've already given your feedback back to the airport?
That's correct, Senator,
right.
And they're working through that.
Right. So did you, was that consideration of the exposure draft, was that all done in-house, or did you engage any external reviewers to look at it?
Well, apart from the agencies, you mean, the ones that I just said, we reviewed it internally.
Right.
Yeah, and then we circulate it to the agencies, as I mentioned.
Okay, so which agencies was it circulated to get feedback from?
CASA, Air Services, Department of Environment.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, and so when was the exposure draft given to you?
About a month, 6 to 8 weeks ago, something.
Yeah,
we can take that on notice. Yeah.
So 1 to 2 months ago, and so sorry, and I must be dinner time. So you have already got you sent your feedback back to the.
That's correct, Senator.
So you turned that around in 2 months
6
period.
to 8 weeks. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. The other issue that I've got is in terms of the land acquisition for the proposed runway. We've heard the media reports about not being able to track down the descendants of John Pascoe Fawkner.
Yes.
So I'm just interested to know, what's currently the status of this process to track down who actually owns the land that you want to acquire.
Certainly, Senator. So we're working with the Department of Finance in regard to the Lands Acquisition Act, And in acquiring land, it's necessary to issue a notice of pre-acquisition declaration, and that's normally issued to the registered owner of a portion of the land. So in doing our due diligence prior to the issue of the PAD, there was unable to be determined, apart from Mr Fawkner, the descendants of that, the current owner since 1850. According to advice, the best way to do that was to advertise. So that's how we did that. And then we're waiting for people to nominate who is the actual owner. We've received 22 nominees so far, and we'll be working through that. We've asked for information as to obviously their names and their bona fides and how they're connected to Mr Fawkner.
So do you engage, consultant genealogists or historians or other experts to help you determine their bona fides as to who is the genuine owner of this land?
Certainly, we'll be taking advice on how best to determine that. Obviously, it's a bit unexpected.
Yes. So have you set a time period by which people have to have put in their claims?
June. Yeah, 1st of June.
1st of June.
Yeah.
Right.
And then we'll work through that, obviously in consultation with Department of Finance, and also obviously appropriate advice from there.
And so is this delaying the major development plan process for the third runway?
No, Senator. It's all working at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when would the land, if you hadn't had this issue, when's the land acquisition expected to take place? Or even with this issue, when do you want to be able to acquire the land?
We'd obviously like to acquire the land as quickly as possible, but obviously we're very interested to make sure that due process is followed, and that everyone who's involved or has an interest in the land parcel is duly noted and has an opportunity to contribute. So we're just working at as a steady pace.
Right. But your standard process would be having the land acquisition occurring at the same time as the assessment.
Agreed.
So if your major development plan is out for consultation for 60 days from August, then so that takes us through until end of October, or no later than that.
That's correct.
What's the timeline on the government's decision?
The government has 50 business days to make a decision on the MDP, and has the opportunity to add an additional 10 business days if the Minister feels that is necessary.
That's 12 weeks or something, so that's an extra 3 months. So you'd be looking at a decision then no later than early next year. We also need to factor in the period where the airport gives due consideration to the submissions received. So depending on how many submissions are received and how complex, and to what the outcome of those submissions are, there could be a couple of months time before it's actually the draft is actually submitted to government for assessment. Right. Okay.
It's probably worth noting the minister can actually there's a stop the clock mechanism if further information is required.
That's correct.
All right. So it may not be as speedy as I was indicating. All right. I've got another issue which is about training airports, which I understand are considered secondary airports, and I've had residents concerned about issues around those airports contacting me.
Which airports?
Depends on the nature of the question, I think.
Yes, I mean, basically, well, it's in general. I mean, Jandakot is the one that has been raised with me, but I particularly wanted to know about how the provisions for secondary or training airports are different to primary airports when it comes to amenity and noise management.
They're not really.
No.
So Senator, the term secondary airport, I guess, is the term that goes to sort of describe it as a general aviation airfield. It doesn't have, at the way these airports are regulated under the Airports Act, so Jandakot is operating under the same regulatory regime as Perth Airport, Moorabbin, same as Melbourne, and so on. So they're actually treated in the same way under the regulations. There is no distinction. I think the term secondary might be perhaps misleading in terms of the regulatory overhead is the same.
So in terms of noise monitoring, so the regulations regarding noise around those airports would be the same?
Well, they need to develop ANEX as part of their master planning process, and we may have some additional information.
Sorry, my colleague was just referring to some questions on notice that you raised previously.
A lot of these matters are actually potentially better directed to Air Services Australia than to...
on the monitoring in particular, because they're responsible for putting the monitoring in place.
All right, okay. I mean, are you able to tell me whether there's any permanent noise monitoring at any of these secondary airports? As I understand there is around the airports. I mean, I can put it on notice to Air Services if you aren't able to tell me, obviously.
I don't think we've got it easily to hand, but we can certainly, if we can take it on notice and work with Air Services Australia.
Okay. All right. And my final issue is, what status does the National Airport Safeguarding Framework have as a guide to zoning and planning issues around airports? It's a document that I've been alerted to on your website, and I'm keen to know how and it's used in airport planning.
Okay, thanks, Senator. I might ask Mr MacArthur to come to the table as well and assist with this one. Basically, there's a number of guidelines that operate around the National Airport Safeguarding Framework. These have been developed over several years, and it's been a focus of the Transport and Infrastructure Council, which is a ministerial council of state and federal government. You'd recognise that a lot of the planning aspects are beyond the airport boundary, and they really sit with local government and state government to implement. But Mr MacArthur may be able to provide some additional advice.
I can just jump in a little bit, just by way of context. The National Airport Safeguarding Framework is a commitment from Commonwealth, state and territory governments with involvement of local government to address a number of issues associated with airports, and it's supported by the National Airport Safeguarding Advisory Group, which is a forum that brings together transport and planning officials to work through issues, whether it be noise, whether it be the public safety zones, or whether it be technical issues such as wind shear, to make sure that planning approvals and processes can actually take into account how to factor in an airport operations with the amenity of the community. So, sorry, Mr MacArthur.
That's right. Senator, as Ms Spence has indicated, it's essentially a joint...
Just go ahead, please.
Sorry, Russell MacArthur, Acting General Manager, Aviation Environment. Thank you, Chair. So, Senator, as been indicated by Ms Spence, the National Airport Safeguarding Group is formed with both the Commonwealth and territories, basically around land use planning off airports, because essentially land use planning still falls within the purview of the state and territory authorities to actually manage the off-airport parts of that. There are a number of guidelines that basically sit under that. So, as Senator Patrick alluded to, the public safety zone guideline is now actually out for consultation at the moment publicly. That's been endorsed by the Transport Infrastructure Senior Officials Committee and is going to the Transport Infrastructure Committee for the Minister's endorsement later this year, is the anticipation around that one.
Right, so that's all of these guidelines, or just the...
So there are a number of guidelines that actually fall under that in a number of areas that have been indicated. So public safety zones, wind shear, aircraft noise, helicopter landing sites. There's a guideline that's been put out currently around that one. Wind turbine risk to aircraft. There's also pilot lighting distraction, managing airspace intrusion, and protection of airspace facilities around communication, navigation and surveillance.
So some of these have been dealt with previously.
Yep.
The current issues before the council around the public, or will be around the public safety zone and the helicopter strategic landing facilities.
Sorry, helicopter strategic.
This is around really protecting access for emergency helicopters, medical helicopters coming into hospitals, so that the planning in cities takes account of the fact that these aircraft need to get into hospitals, into landing pads safely.
So they're signed off by the Ministerial Council.
Yes.
But even after they're signed off, they are still guidelines. They're not.
They are guidelines,
mandatory.
and it's the responsibility of the relevant state and territory to actually implement those.
Right. And do they apply to all airports or just the major airports?
They actually apply to all airports, not just the federally leased airports. So it's a matter, as we're saying, it's a matter for all the states and territories to implement through their planning regimes, but they should apply to any airport.
So, okay, so states and territories around the more secondary airports,
Yeah.
they should be applying them around there. Okay, good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.